The night was just beginning to hum with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses when Richard, the black CEO, stepped onto the yacht. His tailored suit gleamed under the soft glow of the chandeliers, the buzz of the elite crowd filling the air. But what Richard didn't expect was that his arrival would ignite a silent storm among the high society guests, one that would leave him fighting for his dignity in a way he never imagined. As he made his way through the sea of expensive suits and flawless smiles, he couldn't help but notice the subtle glances that slid past him, the ones full of judgment. The hostess, a sharp-eyed blonde with an icy smile, approached him with a forced politeness. But when she asked him to leave, the room fell silent, the shock of the moment hanging thick in the air. Richard knew instantly what was happening. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a calculated move, a blatant act of racial discrimination masked as a mistake. "You don't belong here," she had said coldly, as if his presence was an intrusion. The laughter and chatter around him faded, leaving him in an echoing void of disbelief. The yacht, once a symbol of luxury and privilege, now felt like a cage. But Richard wasn't about to back down. As the hostess's words reverberated through his mind, he realized that this moment, this humiliation, wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more powerful. "I'm not leaving," he thought, his voice steady but firm. "Not until they see me for who I am, not who they want me to be." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, but as Richard looked around, he noticed something. The uncomfortable silence from the onlookers wasn't just out of respect. It was out of fear. Fear of challenging the unspoken rules of the elite. And it was this fear that would make the evening unforgettable. As Richard stood there, his eyes locked onto the hostess who had just humiliated him in front of the crowd, a strange calm washed over him. The loud chatter and clinking of glasses around him seemed to fade, the world narrowing down to just him and her. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the uncomfortable tension thick in the air. For a moment, he considered walking away, letting it go, but then he remembered who he was. He wasn't just some guest at a party who could be easily dismissed. He was a CEO, a leader, and he'd fought too hard to be where he was today. Slowly, he straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and met the hostess's gaze with unwavering confidence. "I'm not going anywhere," Richard said, his voice steady, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. The hostess blinked, taken aback by his defiance, but quickly regained her composure, her fake smile returning. "Excuse me," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I said I'm not leaving," Richard repeated, this time with more emphasis, a challenge in his voice. The room grew deathly silent. The guests, who had been chatting amongst themselves, suddenly stopped, as if they were witnessing something they'd only heard about but never seen. The hostess shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking to the other people in the room, as though seeking some kind of support or validation, but no one said a word. It was as if they were all holding their breath, afraid to speak, afraid to break the uneasy truce that had settled over the gathering. Richard could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. He was outnumbered in terms of power, wealth, and social status, but he wasn't outmatched. He had one thing they didn't, his sense of dignity. "What's the problem?" Richard asked, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is it the color of my skin?" There was a brief pause, and in that instant, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. The hostess's smile faltered for a second, her eyes narrowing, but she quickly recovered. "This is a private event," she said, trying to brush off his accusation. "I'm the one who makes the decisions here." But Richard wasn't done. He took a step forward, his presence commanding, his gaze unwavering. "So, because I don't fit your idea of who belongs in a place like this, you think you can just kick me out? You think you can humiliate me in front of all these people?" His words hung in the air, each one weighted with the years of subtle racism, microaggressions, and systemic oppression he had faced in his life. The guests around him were silent, their eyes darting between him and the hostess, unsure of what to do, but feeling the tension all the same. Richard could see it now, the fear in their eyes. The fear of stepping out of line. The fear of challenging the status quo. But that fear didn't scare him. It fueled him. "You don't get to decide who I am," Richard said, his voice growing more resolute. "You don't get to decide where I belong. Not anymore." The hostess, clearly rattled now, glanced nervously at the other guests, her smile completely gone. For the first time, she realized the power dynamic had shifted. Richard wasn't the one out of place, it was her. The crowd, still silent, began to stir. It was clear that things had changed. Richard had taken control of the narrative, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as the hostess stood frozen, her eyes darting around nervously. Richard could feel the tension building, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He knew he had to press forward. If he backed down now, this would all be for nothing. The people in this room needed to see that they couldn't get away with this kind of behavior anymore. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than. "You think this is a private event?" Richard said, his voice sharp now, cutting through the thick air. "You think you have the right to decide who belongs here based on the color of their skin?" The hostess opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked around, her face flushed with frustration, clearly realizing the weight of the situation was far beyond what she had anticipated. She took a step back, but Richard wasn't finished. "This isn't just about me," he continued, his voice growing more resolute. "This is about every person who has ever been told they don't belong in a place like this. It's about every person who has been judged based on something they can't change." Richard's gaze swept the room, making eye contact with several of the guests, many of whom were still too stunned to speak. Their eyes were wide with a mix of surprise and discomfort. They were witnessing something rare, something that most of them had never seen before. A black man standing his ground in the face of overt racism, demanding the respect he deserved. For a brief moment, Richard thought he saw something shift in the crowd. A few of the guests looked at him differently now, their expressions changing from surprise to understanding. He could sense that the dynamics in the room were starting to change, that maybe some of them were beginning to realize how wrong this was. But there were still others who clung to the old ways, their discomfort more pronounced, their eyes avoiding his. Richard took a deep breath and looked back at the hostess. "I'm not going to let you get away with this," he said calmly, but with a fierce determination in his voice. "You've made a mistake, and you're going to have to own it." The hostess swallowed hard, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for her phone, no doubt preparing to call security or some other authority to handle the situation. But Richard stepped forward, blocking her path, his body language firm. "No one is going to take me out of here," he said, his words deliberate, measured. "Not unless I choose to leave." The room was still, the tension palpable. The guests were watching closely now, unsure of what would happen next. Some were clearly hoping for Richard to back down, for this uncomfortable scene to be over, but others were starting to lean in, curious to see how this would unfold. And then, just as Richard thought the situation couldn't get any more intense, he heard a voice from the back of the room. "Let him stay," the voice said, loud and clear. Richard turned to see a tall, middle-aged man standing by the bar. He was someone Richard recognized, a fellow CEO in a different industry. The man met Richard's gaze and nodded slightly, as if silently offering his support. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The room shifted again, this time with more people looking toward Richard, a few of them starting to murmur among themselves. The hostess's face turned pale. She had underestimated him, underestimated what would happen when someone like Richard decided not to back down. And now, the power had shifted. Richard wasn't the one out of place anymore. The hostess was. As the voice from the back of the room echoed through the space, Richard felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, just a ripple through the crowd, but it was enough to make the hostess hesitate. Her eyes flickered toward the man by the bar, then back to Richard, as if she was trying to gauge the situation, trying to figure out how to salvage the control she had just lost. But it was too late. The moment had passed, and the room had already started to change. Richard stood there, unshaken, his posture still commanding, but his eyes now narrowed slightly in calculation. He could feel the collective breath of the crowd, the way everyone was holding on to see what would happen next, and he knew this was the moment that would define everything. The hostess, now visibly rattled, tried to regain some semblance of control. She cleared her throat and straightened her shoulders, putting on a mask of professionalism. I don't know what you think this is, she said, her voice wavering just enough for Richard to hear, but you're making a scene. Richard didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. I'm not making a scene, he said, his voice steady and firm, you are. The words hung in the air, and for the first time since Richard had walked onto that yacht, the hostess looked like she might crack. The guests, who had been silent up until now, began to murmur among themselves. Richard could feel their eyes on him, some with judgment, but others with a quiet respect. He could see it, the slow, almost imperceptible change in the way they viewed him. He wasn't the outsider anymore. He wasn't the one who didn't belong. The hostess, realizing she had lost the upper hand, quickly looked to the other people in the room, her gaze searching for someone to back her up, but no one spoke. They were all watching, some too afraid to say anything, others unsure of what side to take. Richard's eyes scanned the room, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw someone else, another person, someone in the crowd who had been silent until now, nod in his direction. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. That was the moment Richard knew he had one. The tide had shifted, and it was no longer about his presence in the room, it was about his presence in their minds. He wasn't just the black CEO they had tried to cast aside. He was a force. He had made them see it, and now they couldn't unsee it. The hostess, her face pale, stood frozen, her mask of professionalism slipping further as the room continued to murmur. Richard didn't wait for her to make another move, he knew she was defeated. I'll stay, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And I'm not leaving until I've had the respect I deserve. The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared to speak. The moment felt frozen in time, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But for Richard, there was no more doubt. The power had shifted. He was in control now. And he wasn't going anywhere. The room was still silent, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Richard stood there, unwavering, his presence undeniable. His eyes moved over the guests, slowly taking in their expressions. Some looked away, clearly uncomfortable, while others, those who had been silent spectators just moments ago, were now looking at him differently. It wasn't just surprise anymore. There was something else. Something like respect, or perhaps even admiration. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. Richard could feel it. He didn't have to say anything more, the room had already begun to change. The hostess, still standing frozen in the center of the room, seemed to be struggling to regain her composure. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but the words didn't come. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were waiting. Waiting to see how this would play out, but also waiting to see what kind of person Richard truly was. And in that moment, Richard knew exactly what he had to do. He couldn't let this moment slip by. He had to speak, but he had to speak with conviction. He had to make them understand that this was more than just a disagreement, it was about something much bigger. With a deep breath, Richard stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried a weight that demanded attention. This isn't just about me, Richard said, his eyes locking onto the hostess. This is about all of us. About every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every person who's been treated like they're less than. You see, what you just did wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip-up. It was a choice. And that choice? It has consequences. The hostess flinched at his words, her eyes widening as if she were finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. But Richard wasn't done. He turned to face the rest of the room, sweeping his gaze over the guests, many of whom had been watching quietly up until now. You may think this doesn't concern you, Richard continued, his voice growing steadier, but it does. Because if we let this kind of behavior slide, we're all complicit. And that includes all of you. It's not just about one person being singled out, it's about a system that continues to tell us who gets to be here and who doesn't. There was a moment of silence, and for the first time, Richard saw something in the room shift. Some of the guests exchanged glances, some even nodded subtly, as if they were starting to understand. The air was thick with the weight of his words. For the first time, Richard realized that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. The hostess, her face now pale and her shoulders sagging, seemed to realize the battle was over. She had no more power here. Richard had taken control of the room, and there was nothing she could do to take it back. Slowly, as the realization settled over her, she took a step back. Her eyes flickered between the guests, but no one came to her aid. The room was still. The power had shifted. Richard, with all his strength and resolve, had won not just the moment, but the respect he had always deserved. He had fought for his dignity, and in doing so, he had forced the world around him to see him for who he truly was, a man who was not to be overlooked or dismissed. As Richard stood there, the weight of the room finally sinking in, he knew this moment would stay with him forever. He had changed something in that room, something deep. He had forced everyone to look at the truth they had been avoiding. As the hostess stepped back, her face pale and her demeanor defeated, the atmosphere in the room began to shift even further. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt different, it was charged, almost expectant. Richard could feel the eyes of the guests on him, some in disbelief, others with a growing sense of understanding. He had said what needed to be said, and now, the room seemed to be waiting for the next move. Richard stood tall, his presence commanding, yet the tension in his body was starting to ease. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen next, but he was ready for whatever came. For the first time in a long while, he felt the raw weight of the power he had over the situation. He could see the hesitation in the eyes of the other guests, some were clearly uncomfortable, others were ashamed, and a few looked like they were reconsidering their own biases. It was clear that his words had reached them, that they were beginning to process what had just unfolded. But there was still a sense of uncertainty in the air. Richard knew he had made an impact, but it wasn't enough yet. This moment, this confrontation, needed to go beyond just a fleeting victory. He had to make sure that what happened here tonight wasn't just a one-off moment of defiance, it had to be part of something bigger. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," Richard said, breaking the silence once again, his voice calm but firm. "I came here to show that no one, no matter who they are or where they come from, should ever be treated this way. And if we let moments like this pass without calling them out, then we're all complicit in allowing this system to continue." His words hung in the air, and Richard watched as they sank in. The hostess remained silent, her expression unreadable now, as if she were still trying to comprehend what had just happened. But the crowd, some of them, at least, was beginning to come to life. People who had been standing still, avoiding eye contact, were now slowly approaching, their voices low, speaking to each other in hushed tones. A few of them even looked directly at Richard, a quiet acknowledgement in their eyes. Richard's gaze swept the room once more, and he saw it, the shift. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Some of the guests, those who had been too silent before, now seemed to be considering what they had just witnessed. Richard had made them confront something they had been too afraid to face, the reality of their own prejudices. And in doing so, he had opened a door, one that couldn't be closed again. For a brief moment, Richard caught the eye of the man from the bar, the one who had spoken up earlier. The man gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Richard's heart steadied. This was the beginning of something. The change he had hoped for, the shift in the atmosphere, was finally taking shape. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone in the room. The hostess, her face still flushed with embarrassment, finally spoke. I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now, lacking the force it had earlier. "I didn't mean for this to get out of hand." Richard could see that she was trying to regain control, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Richard didn't need her apology. He had already won. He had shown her, and everyone else, what it meant to stand up for yourself, to demand respect. "It's not about what you meant," Richard replied coolly, "it's about what you did. And you'll have to live with that." With that, he turned and made his way to the center of the room, where the crowd had begun to gather. He wasn't just leaving the situation behind, he was moving forward, and this moment would be a reminder for everyone there, no matter how wealthy or powerful they were, that the fight for dignity and equality didn't end in one confrontation. It was just the beginning. As Richard walked through the crowd, his movements were slow and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of everything he had just confronted. He could feel the eyes of the guests following him, some lingering in curiosity, others with a tinge of guilt, and a few with growing respect. The hostess, now standing off to the side, seemed to shrink under his gaze. Her earlier arrogance had dissolved, replaced by the awareness of just how much power Richard held in that moment. He didn't need to say another word, his presence alone spoke volumes. The room, once buzzing with the shallow chatter of high society, was now silent, save for the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd. People were still processing what had happened, how a black man, a CEO, had turned the tide of a room filled with the most influential and privileged individuals. Richard was a man who had spent his life fighting to be seen as equal, to earn his place at tables where people like him were often kept at arm's length. And now, in front of these people, he had demanded that respect. He had made them see him, not as a stereotype, but as a force to be reckoned with. "You see," Richard said aloud, breaking the silence, his voice calm yet firm, "this isn't just about one instance of discrimination. It's about a system that has made it acceptable for people to be treated differently based on the color of their skin. It's about the years, the decades, the centuries of this behavior being normalized. And if we keep allowing it, if we keep letting it slide, we are just as guilty." He let the weight of his words sink in, watching as the guests around him slowly began to react. Some lowered their heads, others exchanged uneasy glances, but more and more people were nodding subtly, as though coming to an unspoken realization. Richard could see that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of tension, it was a shift, a crack in the veneer of the high society bubble they had been living in. They had been forced to confront something they had been too comfortable ignoring. He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch, before continuing. "This is what I mean when I say we have to do better. We have to stop letting these moments go by without calling them out. We have to stop turning a blind eye to the everyday racism that happens all around us, in places just like this one." His words weren't just directed at the hostess anymore, they were for everyone in the room. Richard wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore, he was fighting for the dignity of every person who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or excluded because of the color of their skin. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for a generation of people who had been told they weren't good enough. And in that moment, Richard knew. He had won something far greater than just a victory in this one room. He had taken a stand, and it would echo far beyond the walls of this yacht. As the minutes passed, more guests began to approach him. It started with a few hesitant steps, a few whispered words of acknowledgement, but soon, others joined in. They weren't just offering words of support, they were offering something deeper. The kind of silent recognition that only came when people understood the gravity of what had happened. Richard didn't say much more after that. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. The room had changed, and the people in it would never forget this moment. He had forced them to confront their own biases, to realize that they could no longer hide behind their privilege. They had to do better. And Richard, the man they had tried to push out, had made sure they knew it. As the evening wore on, the mood in the room had changed drastically. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had shifted into something deeper, more profound. Richard could feel the transformation in the air. The guests who had once viewed him with suspicion or detachment were now looking at him in a new light. Some approached him with quiet, almost hesitant words of support, others with nods of understanding, as if they were beginning to grasp the weight of what had transpired. It wasn't just about the altercation with the hostess anymore, it was about something much larger. Richard could see that, in a sense, he had become a catalyst, a symbol of something people were afraid to acknowledge but knew, deep down, they needed to address. As the crowd began to disperse, some lingering in small groups, Richard stood at the center of it all, still processing the events that had unfolded. He wasn't just a participant in this moment, he had become the voice of something larger, a call for change that had been long overdue. He couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing that, for once, he had made an undeniable impact. He had forced these people to confront the truth. And now, they couldn't unsee it. He felt a tap on his shoulder, and when he turned, it was the man from the bar, the one who had nodded in support earlier. The man gave Richard a respectful smile, his expression warm but guarded. You did well, the man said, his voice low but genuine. You didn't back down. Not many would have the guts to do that. Richard nodded, acknowledging the compliment, but his thoughts were elsewhere. This wasn't about bravery, not for him. This was about a sense of duty, a responsibility to stand up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized. Thank you, Richard said, his voice steady, but this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. We all need to be better. We all need to do more. The man's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. You're right. We all have our part to play. There was a brief silence between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was as if, in that moment, an unspoken understanding had passed between them. Richard could see that this was the beginning of something more, something bigger than one night, bigger than just this yacht party. This was the start of a conversation that needed to happen, the kind of conversation that had been avoided for far too long. The man gave Richard one last nod before walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Richard watched him go, then turned back to the room. The guests were beginning to break up into smaller groups again, but the conversations were different now. They were quieter, more thoughtful. Richard had done something tonight. He had made them question their assumptions, their prejudices. He had forced them to see the world differently, and that, he knew, was the real victory. As the night came to a close, Richard made his way toward the exit, feeling the weight of the evening settle in. He had not only stood his ground, but he had changed the dynamic in that room. And as he stepped off the yacht, he realized that the work wasn't over. It had only just begun. The fight for equality, for respect, was an ongoing battle, one that would take more than just one person standing up. But Richard had shown that it was possible. He had shown that, no matter how powerful or privileged someone might be, they could not erase the truth. And that was something that could never be taken away. As Richard stepped off the yacht and onto the pier, he took a deep breath, the cool night air hitting his face. It felt like the weight of the entire evening had lifted, but he knew that this moment wasn't over. The events that had transpired were only a small part of the larger battle that still lay ahead. As he walked away from the crowd, he couldn't help but think about the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just about standing up to the hostess or making a point in front of a room full of privileged people. It was about more than that. It was about changing the narrative, about forcing people to acknowledge their own biases, and demanding accountability for the ways in which society had allowed these prejudices to flourish for so long. Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his assistant, something about an upcoming board meeting. But his mind was still on the yacht, on the people who had witnessed his stand, and on the realization that this wasn't just his fight, it was everyone's fight. As Richard made his way to his car, his thoughts shifted to the people who had stood by him during the confrontation. The man from the bar, the few guests who had nodded in silent acknowledgement. It was these small gestures that had meant the most. They weren't grand, sweeping acts of heroism, but they were steps in the right direction. The kind of quiet resistance that was often more powerful than any loud proclamation. He thought about the conversation he'd had with the man who had offered his support, the brief but meaningful exchange that had reminded him that not everyone was blind to the injustices around them. That was what gave him hope, that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. As he sat in his car, staring out the windshield at the darkened city ahead, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had made an impact, but that was just the beginning. The real work was in the aftermath. The conversations that would be had in the coming days, the changes that would slowly but surely take root. It would take time, but Richard was patient. He knew that lasting change didn't happen overnight. It was a process, a slow, often painful process, but one that could not be avoided. As he drove away from the marina, Richard's mind wandered. To the people who hadn't spoken up, to those who had silently watched but had done nothing. He couldn't help but wonder if they were now questioning their own beliefs, their own actions. It wasn't enough to simply be non-racist, people had to be actively anti-racist. The kind of passive indifference that allowed discrimination to continue was just as harmful as the overt acts of racism. Richard had challenged them all to think differently, to look at their own behavior, and to consider the impact they had on the world around them. It was an uncomfortable challenge, but one that needed to be faced. As he pulled onto the highway, Richard felt the weight of the night begin to settle in. He had stood his ground, and for that, he was proud. But there was still much to be done. This was just one step, one moment in a much larger journey. And Richard was ready for whatever came next. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared to keep fighting. For himself, for his community, and for the generations that would come after him. The following days were a whirlwind for Richard. He had expected the usual fallout after making such a bold stand, but what he hadn't anticipated was how deeply the events from the yacht would resonate. His phone was constantly buzzing with messages, some congratulatory, others questioning, some from people who had witnessed the confrontation, and a few from old colleagues who had watched the incident unfold from the sidelines. It was clear that his actions had sparked something in people. The quiet murmurs of support were becoming louder, and it seemed like the conversation about race, power, and privilege that he had initiated on the yacht was continuing to ripple outward. As the week went on, Richard was invited to speak at several events. Some of the invitations were from organizations that had always been at the forefront of racial justice work, others from corporate boards who, after seeing the attention he had garnered, wanted to know how they could do better. It was overwhelming. In a way, he had never expected this kind of attention, let alone to become a symbol for the very thing he had spent his career fighting against. But as the requests piled up, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. This moment was more than just a chance to be heard, it was an opportunity to change the narrative for people who looked like him. He had a platform now, a voice that had the potential to reach thousands, millions, even. And that was something he wasn't going to take lightly. He began to speak more openly about his experiences, about the microaggressions he had faced, the way his success had always been overshadowed by the color of his skin. He shared stories of the subtle ways people tried to undermine him, to reduce his accomplishments to mere luck or happenstance. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He wasn't interested in presenting a polished, perfect version of his journey. He wanted people to see the struggle, the truth behind every victory. This isn't just about one incident, Richard said in a public interview, his voice steady but intense. It's about the everyday battles, the things we're all too often too scared or too complacent to talk about. The way racism doesn't always look like a man in a hood or an outright hate crime, it's the things we let slide, the assumptions we make, the opportunities we deny. That's the real fight. And it's happening every day, all around us. As Richard continued to share his story, he noticed something else happening. The people who had once been on the sidelines, who had stayed quiet, who had maybe felt uncomfortable in their privilege, were starting to speak up. He received messages from colleagues, from friends who had never addressed these issues with him before, admitting their own biases, apologizing for their silence, and expressing a desire to learn. It wasn't perfect, he wasn't looking for perfection, but it was a start. And that was what mattered. Richard knew that the real work was in these conversations, in the uncomfortable spaces where people confronted their own complicity. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't pretending to. But what he had learned from the yacht incident was that one voice could change the course of a room, and it could spark a chain reaction of change. That night on the yacht had been just the beginning. It had taken one powerful moment of defiance to start the process, but the real transformation would happen when people took what he had said to heart and applied it to their lives. Richard wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but he was prepared. He had made his stand, and he had already seen the ripple effect. Now, it was about sustaining that momentum, keeping the conversation alive, and pushing forward, no matter how difficult it got. Richard's influence continued to grow in ways he hadn't expected. The stories of his stand on the yacht spread beyond the social circles that had initially witnessed the confrontation, reaching news outlets, social media, and even professional organizations. It wasn't just a viral moment, it became a movement. The same people who had once turned a blind eye to the inequalities he had faced were now approaching him for advice, asking how they could be part of the solution. They wanted to know how to have difficult conversations about race in their own organizations, how to shift the culture in environments where diversity had always been an afterthought. Richard found himself on panels, in interviews, and at the center of discussions about systemic racism in corporate America. It was surreal. He had never imagined that a single act of defiance, one seemingly small moment, could spark such widespread reflection. But as the weeks went on, Richard also began to feel the weight of it all. The responsibility was enormous, and sometimes, it was exhausting. Every interview, every conversation about race, felt like a reminder of the personal toll that racism had taken on his life. The endless microaggressions, the constant battle to prove himself, the exhausting need to always be better to earn the same respect his white counterparts received so easily, these were the things Richard had carried with him for years, quietly and without complaint. Now, they were out in the open. There was no going back. But Richard understood that this was part of the work. He wasn't doing this for the applause or recognition, he was doing it for the next generation, for those who wouldn't have to fight the same battles he did. He thought often about his own journey, how he had started with nothing, how he had worked tirelessly to get to where he was today, and how every achievement was always shadowed by the color of his skin. This was his chance to make sure that future generations of black professionals wouldn't have to walk that same painful path. One evening, after another long day of interviews and meetings, Richard sat at his desk in his office, reviewing the many messages of support and frustration that continued to flood his inbox. A few messages stood out, a few people from different industries who shared their personal stories of bias and discrimination, people who thanked him for giving them the courage to speak up. These messages were a reminder that the conversation wasn't just about his experience, it was about the collective struggle, the shared pain, and the collective desire to see change. Richard allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had always been determined, always driven by the need to succeed, to prove his worth in a world that often tried to diminish it. But now, he was fueled by something deeper, something more enduring. He was fueled by the idea that real change was possible, that it didn't have to be a fight lost before it even began. He had been able to make people uncomfortable, to force them to reckon with their biases, and in doing so, he had started something that would continue to build long after the yacht party was a distant memory. The journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. Richard knew that the path ahead would not be easy. He had already seen how difficult it could be to challenge deep-seated systems of inequality. But he was more committed than ever. He was in this for the long haul. He wasn't just a black CEO making noise, he was a catalyst for a movement that, with time, would lead to real change, the kind of change that would endure, one conversation at a time. Months passed, and Richard's influence only continued to expand. What had started as a single act of defiance on that yacht had transformed into a much larger movement, one that was making waves in corporate America and beyond. He became a sought-after speaker at conferences, a voice of reason in panel discussions, and a leader in a growing community of activists and professionals who were determined to challenge the status quo. It wasn't easy, of course. The work was constant, and the challenges were numerous. Richard often found himself facing resistance from people who were too entrenched in their ways to see things differently. There were still moments when the weight of his responsibility felt overwhelming, when he questioned whether the impact he was having was enough. But then, he would hear the stories of people who were changing, people who were starting to have difficult conversations in their workplaces, in their families, in their communities. He would see the shift in attitudes, however small, and he knew that all of it mattered. Every step forward, no matter how incremental, was a victory. As the movement gained traction, Richard found himself working with other leaders, collaborating with organizations that had been fighting for racial justice long before the yacht incident. Together, they began to build something that felt sustainable, a network of individuals and institutions dedicated to dismantling systemic racism, not just in theory, but in practice. Richard had always known that real change required more than just words, it required action, sustained commitment, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And so, he continued to push, continued to challenge, and continued to speak out. The message he had delivered on the yacht about the everyday microaggressions, about the subtle and not-so-subtle ways racism permeated every corner of society, had sparked a fire that he was determined to keep burning. One day, Richard received an unexpected call from the CEO of a major company, someone he had admired from afar but never imagined would reach out to him. The CEO, a white man, was calling to thank him for his leadership, to express his admiration for the way Richard had handled the situation on the yacht, and to ask how he could help in the fight for racial equity. "I've been listening," the CEO said, "and I realize now how much work we still have to do, how much privilege I've taken for granted. I want to be part of the solution. How can I help? Richard was taken aback at first, but then he felt a surge of hope. This was the kind of moment he had hoped for. This was a leader, someone with power and influence, who wasn't just apologizing, but was actually committed to doing the work. It starts with listening, Richard replied. It starts with acknowledging that there's a problem, and then taking responsibility for it. And it means doing the hard work of creating space for people who have been excluded for far too long. The conversation marked a turning point for Richard. It wasn't about him anymore, it was about a larger, collective effort to change the systems that had been in place for generations. And it was clear to him now that, in some small way, his actions had opened the door for others to begin walking through it. The fight was far from over, but Richard was no longer standing alone. He had sparked something much bigger than himself, something that would continue to grow and spread, one conversation at a time. As he looked back on everything that had happened, the confrontation on the yacht, the weeks of reflection, the partnerships with like-minded leaders, he realized that he had done more than make an impact. He had started a movement, one that would change the landscape of corporate America, one that would change the world. And he wasn't going to stop until the work was done.